I know we keep talking about AI. I said I was going to bring like an AI swear jar for every time the AI was said. We're going to put $1 in the jar. I was going to walk away rich. But we wouldn't have an AI focus if we didn't bring Nvidia, right? So thank you, Keith, for being here, because you're going to give us some insight as to how you're working with the corporate community and supporting startups and where the opportunities are. And Eric, thank you very much for the support that BGV continues to bring to this program. It's really important that we have organizations like BGV that continue to support this event and other GCV global events, and we appreciate that partnership. So thank you both. And Keith, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Sit right here?
Oh, yeah, yes.
In the middle?
To sit here.
Sounds good. All right. Great to be here.
Okay, so hello, good morning. I'm very pleased and proud to have Kevin joining us, and obviously Nvidia, nothing to say about it. You all know about the company. Yeah. But I think the best secret is a very interesting job that Kevin has at Nvidia. So Kevin, can you introduce yourself and tell us what you do there?
So it's great to be here. I want to thank my friend Jeff Herbst for plugging me in. I want to thank the Institute for having us. I joined NVIDIA 5 years ago, and in 2019, it wasn't a given that you'd always invite NVIDIA to be at the table for an AI conversation. And so things have come a long way. My title is Worldwide AI Initiatives, but actually it's kind of an umbrella. My main focus for the past 5 years has really been building our focus on sovereign AI programs across the world. So interfacing with all the world's governments, all the foreign governments, I should say, for the most part, and building strategic relationships and partnerships where possible to really help them advance their national AI programs. And we did that fairly quietly over the last 5 years, again, partly because no one probably wouldn't believe we were doing it, and why would NVIDIA be in that role? And secondly, because we weren't sure where it was going to go. But it really started to accelerate in the last few years. And of course, post-ChatGPT in November 2022, we've seen an exponential acceleration in sort of the global policy imperative, not just to focus on AI, but to specifically invest in sovereign AI infrastructure within nations' borders so that they would have more resiliency. And of course, that's where I spend most of my time.
So now, of course, there is no reporter in the room, and I suspect you spend time discussing with all this government. What is it to talk about AI and infrastructure to the government? Do they get it?
Well, no, that's a great question. So, I think they're getting it more and more now. But if you go back to 2020, I had a meeting with the OECD in Paris to talk about this exact question, because I had this independent sort of aha moment after being at NVIDIA for about 18 months. I had gone around the world, met with a lot of ministers and heads of state, and had this simple conversation of, well, what is your plan to build up the infrastructure you need to implement your AI plan? Because every country basically has an AI plan by now. But I said, well, what's your plan to build the infrastructure under that plan? And what was just shocking is the answer was just crickets. There was just no answer, none. And nobody had a clue what I was talking about. And so I came to the striking conclusion in 2020 that no nation on earth has a clue whether they have enough computing to actually fulfill the vision that they've set for themselves. But interestingly, at the same time, the OECD had reached the same conclusion. And they were very concerned because everyone could see that AI was going to play an increasingly bigger role in global and local economies. But if countries were making these big promises to themselves and their citizens, but then not investing in the right infrastructure, then of course these things wouldn't happen. So there was a real disconnect from a policy perspective. So we actually ended up setting up the AI Compute Expert Group at the OECD, and I was the founding chair of that. And we spent the next 2 years basically building out a blueprint for nations on what to think about. And this wasn't a blueprint for GPUs, just to be clear. This is about computing infrastructure, regardless of what's in the box, and to just really think about it. So I think the world's come a long way. But again, you have to credit sort of this, this iPhone moment of AI, right? Yeah. The ChatGPT that kind of woke everyone up to the fact that this is happening, it's real, you better make the right investments. And again, in the past 18 months, we've seen deals go from, 50 million to 2 billion. I mean, the scale of deals are dramatic. So when people talk about AI being a bubble, I mean, look, I don't know. Look, I'm not an investor by trade, and I don't make any predictions at all on whether it's the industry or startups or our stock price. I'm gonna stay away from that. But what I will tell you is that there's no bubble in the demand. I mean, the demand is, and there's no. It is so diverse across industries, across the world, across countries, from the public sector to the private sector. It's really quite overwhelming.
Now, could you give example of a government that get it?
Yeah.
And even when they get it, what are the typical output or plan? What is maybe a good example to be successful?
Yeah.
And maybe which type of mistake are they doing?
Yep.
Which type of government don't get it?
Yeah, so one of the first questions I get when I sit down with a senior official or sometimes even, a prime minister, in a closed room, they'll say, well, who's out in front? Who do we need to be looking at? It's a very common question, right? Everyone wants to benchmark themselves against somebody. And obviously, if you take out, you really need to take out US and China from that equation, just because they're so large and there's so much going on both those countries. It kind of distorts the view a little bit. So just remove those two countries. And I sit on the National AI Advisory Committee for President Biden, so I have a pretty good view of what we're doing in the US. And the US is actually in good shape. I mean, the truth is the US has caught up. It was a little bit behind going back to 2020, or even earlier than that, but it has actually caught up. So I think from a strategic policy perspective, the US is doing a lot of things right. But again, there's such an incredibly strong private sector here and so much. So you just remove US and China for a moment and then look at everybody else. And if you look at everybody else, frankly, there's a pretty big disparity across the world. And some of the largest, wealthiest, most advanced economies are far from leading in this space. And I describe, the way I look at it, leading is countries with very strong sort of political leadership. Like this is not just a headline or a speech, but actual dedicated, we're going to get this done. That's combined with money. That is, we're going to allocate public resources, right? We're going to do that. And then the third thing is we're going to work really closely with the other parts of the economy, like the private sector and academia, to execute this, right? And so we're going to do a very sort of, both whole of government but all-encompassing approach. And you really only see that. Not exclusively, but you see it more in the smaller countries that are able to be a little more nimble, move a little bit faster. But you have sort of this portfolio of countries that stretches from Southeast Asia to the Middle East, and that is really where we see the majority of the really strong top-down focus. But there are some exceptions, and actually, when I look across Europe, the one country that really kind of pops out to me over the past year that has, I think, really done a really great job of catching up is the UK. UK's always had a lot of strong advantages. London's always been a strong AI hub, but they were falling behind in a bunch of areas, and very much so in compute. And the Prime Minister in the spring of 2023 basically surrounded himself with a number of key advisors, I think 2 of whom came from the private sector, and said, let's get some stuff done. And between his focus and that very skilled team, they achieved everything they set out to do. They did the Bletchley event with the Global AI Summit. That was a big success. They bought a national supercomputer for about $275 million. They changed the national budget to allocate $500 million a year going forward for computing. They just did a whole bunch of things that I think were really concrete achievements. And you don't always see that, quite frankly, in the West. And so I think there are some examples now. But here's what I believe. I think over the next decade, I believe that the global calculus for competitiveness is going to change, and that countries that have made investments in their ecosystems and in their workforce and in their infrastructure around AI are going to see material gains that other countries won't have.
So basically, the answer is small is beautiful, agility.
Yeah.
It looks like a startup.
Well, look at Nvidia, right? I think this is a good example. I use Nvidia in some of these conversations. We have slightly less than 30,000 employees. Now, if you're a startup, that sounds like a lot, but relative to the world's biggest companies, that is not a lot of employees. That is a small company by any measure. We're not even in the top 125 biggest companies in America by number of employees, but we're the 3rd most valuable company in the world. Right? How is that possible to have that few employees generating that much value? And the answer is AI, right? The answer is computing. We have 4 of the world's most powerful computers under our roof. And they're working 24 hours a day creating value while we sleep. They're extending the productivity of our employees. They help us design chips. They help us engage with our customers. They help us run the business. So we use computing and AI to take 30,000 people and make it seem like 300,000 people. And I think the message there is, so small countries can absolutely punch above their weight. I fully expect countries like Singapore and Vietnam and Serbia and Hungary and maybe even Malta and these sort of smaller countries that generally don't rank very high in Estonia was here earlier, and I have a deep fondness of Estonia. I actually worked on the AI strategy for Estonia personally back in 2018. So these small countries are going to way overpunch in their capabilities because you don't need. When we talk about factories, right? AI factories are data centers with computers in them, right? It's not the same idea of a traditional, industrial, the third industrial revolution, right? A fourth industrial revolution factory is a data center, right? Packed with GPUs. So that, surrounded by talented data scientists who are being supported by a regulatory sandbox who have access to data. That is what the new value chain looks like. And that's where wealth creation and frankly, geopolitical influence is going to come from.
Yeah. So obviously, in the audience, we have a lot of large corporations, big delegation from Japan,
yeah.
a lot of large companies from Europe, some from Southeast Asia. What is their role in this policy? What would you recommend this large company to do with this national AI initiatives?
Well, since you mentioned Japan, I do want to point out that Japan is another country that's really come from behind, I think, in AI in the past year. I mean, Japan's always been a leader in technology and in robotics and even computing. The #1 computer in the world, fastest computer, Fugaku, is in Japan. But overall, from a policy perspective, from a whole of government perspective, Japan was not really super organized around this until last year. Yeah. They really got on it. And now Japan has jumped up. And we were in Tokyo in November with the Prime Minister, signed a new partnership. And I think you're going to see a dramatic expansion of computing and AI in Japan. So I think some really good progress there. But to your question, look, the governments of the world do not have the resources to close this gap, right? I mean, there is this thing. We call it the compute divide. Well, you've heard of the digital divide, right? So one of the sub-narratives of the digital divide is the compute divide, right? And this is very interesting because you see this compute divide both across nations and within nations. Even the U.S., right? The wealthiest nation in the world has a huge compute divide. And one of the big pieces of policy that has been being pushed on Washington in this respect that has gotten some momentum recently is called the National AI Research Resources, NAIR, and it's really about addressing the lack of access to high-end computing here in the U.S. And you think, how could that be, even in the U.S., right? But the truth is, and I'll give you some startling statistics, is that 100% of the world's high-performance computing sits in 32 countries. There are 195 countries in the world, but the vast majority of them do not have a supercomputer. So 85% of the world's countries cannot compute a large language model. So just think about that. Right? So now let that trickle down. That means 85% of the students and young people growing up in those countries are not within proximity of a computer on which they can train. Right? They'll have to leave their country to go somewhere else to learn that skill. No, they can access it through the web like anybody else, but to be close to those professors and those scientists, to be at the centers of excellence, those COEs are only in 32 countries. So that's the sovereign compute divide. Part of the way the world's going to close that gap is by the public and the private sector working together. It's the only way, right? And we see this across the world. In Japan, for example, the Japanese government's going to be making a substantial investment in computing, but the way that they're doing it is they're creating a fund to subsidize the private sector to go buy infrastructure. There's kind of a sliding scale of subsidy based on who you are. So SoftBank will get this, and a small to medium enterprise will get this, and that kind of thing. And so there's different subsidies, but we'll pay $1, you put $2 in, kind of thing. And so we're seeing that in India, we're seeing that in Singapore, we're seeing it all across the world. So I think that there's huge opportunities for the private sector to not just get involved and not just do it because it's the right thing for your nation, but to actually be part of that business opportunity of closing that divide and being at the forefront of all that innovation. I mean, one interesting anecdote, I was in a country recently, and we had a meeting with the Deputy Prime Minister and the top AI company. There was about 8 people in the room, basically the 8 leaders of AI for that nation. We were having this exact conversation, and the Deputy Prime Minister asked the group, well, how many GPUs do you think we need? And she goes, and then she said, well, before they answered, she goes, what about 20,000? Is that enough? And the president of the largest AI company in the country said, I need 40,000, and I'm one company. So if we're not talking about 200,000 GPUs, then we're not having a serious conversation. And she said, well, there's no way our government could cover that. He goes, well, we'll be your first customer. Let's do it together. Let's create a shared infrastructure, and we'll sign up. Like, right there in front of me, you could just see the public-private consortium forming, and that's so. I just think there's opportunity. You just have to look for it. But everybody is going to have to figure this out, and countries, their economic competitiveness is on the table.
So for the large corporation in the room, is your recommendation, say, be careful? The supercomputing center are going to move. You need to go there, or should they build their own supercomputing center because they have the capacity, they have the people, they have the balance sheet?
Yeah, I don't know there's one right answer for everybody, but we're seeing all of the above. So there is, I think it was in the press, and there was, last year, there was a private equity fund here in the US that actually bought $500 million worth of GPU. Yeah. To set up their own supercomputing center of excellence for their portfolio, because they wanted to remove access to computing as a gating factor for their companies. And that was very smart. I haven't seen that a lot, but we are seeing countries do that now. So everywhere from India to Taiwan, you're starting to see these sort of dedicated AI clouds being built up. Again, some are being done under a full government umbrella, that is in a government data center, and others are just setting up funds to subsidize private sector consumption. But either way, they know that if they can work with the private sector to do that. So I think very bold, innovative companies will want to close that gap for themselves, especially if your ecosystem, that is your corporate arm, a VC arm, and you have a growing portfolio of companies that need access to computing. There's a good strategic reason to perhaps bring that computing in-house or in partnership with a third party, so that you don't have to, that's no longer a factor. I think starting 2023 was the first year that investors have to start doing raises just for computing. And the first time I even realized this was about a year ago. It was last spring. We had about 100 investors at HQ, and we were talking about it, and it occurred to me almost in real time that if you're not raising money just for computing, then you're probably failing your investors, your investments. And then over the course of the year, we saw this a few times. And there was one company, I think it's in Canada, but that announced publicly that they were raising $500 million just for computing. So depending on your business, if training large models is going to be a critical part of your business, you can't just assume that computing is available. It's neither infinite nor easy. You have to go out and raise money for it. You have to secure that access, and in some cases, you may or may want to buy it or lease it. But it'll be one of the most important decisions that you make. Yeah.
The message well received, and obviously, it may not be well known, but if I remember correctly, half of your employees are in software.
Yeah.
So the software stack created by Nvidia is almost as important as the hardware. So
that's right.
How would you describe the ambition level of Nvidia in software, and how critical it would be over time, the software skill to use this AI versus the raw compute power?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I remember very clearly going to the very first employee town hall meeting in October 2019, a few months after I joined, and the company, Jensen kind of sat down on stage. He had the big screen behind him. He had this one slide up, and he spent an hour on this one single slide, and he was very redundant. He kept saying sort of a few things over and over and over and over again. And I, he's really trying to kind of drill a couple things into all of our heads. And there's about 300 of us in the room, and thousands watching it live streamed. And what he was saying 5 years ago is exactly what he says now. He hasn't changed or pivoted a thing. What he says is, we are not a chip company. We are a full stack accelerated computing platform, and our software will be even more important than our hardware. And if we never talk about GPUs, that's fine. Mm-hmm. Right? This is what he said to us 5 years ago. He doesn't really think of us as a GPU company. We're not a chip company. We're a computing platform, and that platform is available everywhere, and more of the value from that platform comes from the software than the hardware. And that was a very visionary, strategy that predates all the craziness we're seeing now, and he has stuck to it. So yes, of the 30,000 employees, we have more people working on software than we do on hardware. And I think he announced recently that we've hit in our last earnings, 1 billion in software sales, which doesn't sound like a lot relative to our total revenues, but it's obviously a very important part of the business, and we're growing it extensively, and it's high margin, and it's good, all that good stuff. So I think in the future, when you look we're already in robotics, we're already in self-driving cars. I mean, we're doing all those things, but I think the monetization path from all that will not just be hardware; it'll increasingly be software.
Thank you very much, Keith, and also clear summary. You have to secure your compute power, and don't forget that over time, software will be more important than the hardware.
Yeah.
Keith, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Session.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.